Do you remember the scene? It's the scene after Nahida is confronted by Dotori and he trades the information the Fatui have discovered about the Descenders for her Gnosis. She tells us that we are the 4th Descender and that she checked for information about the Traveler and their twin in Irminsul. She says our twin is not a Descender, but do you remember who she says the first Descender was? Did you say the primordial one? Interesting, because that's not what she says. She says the heavenly principles, and I know what you're thinking, okay, so they're the same being. It's kind of weird how easily everyone just accepts that they're the same person, right? Especially considering how vehemently people disagreed when I said Remus was also the primordial one, when there's actual evidence of them being referred to by the same titles and being portrayed as creator deities, but I digress. Let's forget all of that for now. In fact, let's forget everything. All the lore descriptions on the wiki, all the videos, including mine, especially mine, everything we've ever thought about the lore but did not see for ourselves and there is no record of in-game. Let's just take a hard look at everything we actually know from in-game sources about the Descenders. Once we've established all the facts, and only after we've established them, we can build a case from there and try to figure out not only who the 4 Descenders are, but why there are only 4. But first, the 4.3 recap. Navia doesn't realize she's in charge of the literal mafia. The end. Look, I like Navia, she's fun, but she's also a liability. The fact she doesn't understand just how much power she has and is so desperate to find someone to share responsibility with makes her dangerous. Any nefarious actor that's able to suss out her codependent nature could potentially gain control of Fontaine's criminal underworld as long as they're willing to let her call them partner. Aside from that, we got a couple new artifact sets. The Song of Days Past lore is like Golden Troop 2, Egeria Boogaloo, so that's cool. Really thin on story content this patch, but I've been alright because Navi and Chevy have been very fun. Anyway, 4 Descenders, that's weird, right? How can there only be 4? We already know more than 4 people have arrived from outside Tibet. At the very least, there's 5. The 4 labeled Descenders plus the Abyss Twin. It's more than that. The point is, 5 is more than 4. Not only that, but Narizen Cruz plan to become a Descender. We'll revisit that later, because we've already gotten ahead of ourselves. How do we know there are only 4 Descenders? Well, because Nahida tells us as much. After telling us we are the 4th, Paimon asks Nahida if she means that there are 3 Descenders before the Traveler and that the Abyss Twin isn't one of them. And Nahida says, that's right. There you go. 4 Descenders. Not sure that was up for debate, but that's what we know based on in-game sources. Before we leave Nahida, she also tells us something else, that her hypothesis is that the Heavenly Principles is the first. Now, a hypothesis isn't fact, but come on, it's Nahida. You gotta be heartless to slashed out that face. Regardless, we don't know it for certain, so I'll just put an asterisk when I reference it in the future. Or I would if a pep didn't tell us that it was the Heavenly Principles that first defeated Nibelung. And that's how you get ahead of comments saying, but a pep called them the primordial one. Who am I kidding? I'll still get those comments. There's a couple other things a pep tells us that I want us to keep in mind for later, that the victor in the war between the Heavenly Principles and the dragons won the right to shape the world, and that the Dragon King returned. Fast forward to good old Skirk's position. She tells us that the 1st and 2nd Descenders crafted the Gnosis from the remains of the 3rd. That doesn't seem like a lot to go on, but it actually gives us a lot of info. First, for the Gnosis to be crafted from the remains of the 3rd, they have to have perished. They're remains after all. Second, that the 1st and 2nd Descenders are still alive, or at least were when the 3rd died. And they worked together toward a common goal that required the Gnosis to be created. That gives us a bit of a timeline to work with. We know that the Heavenly Principles is the 1st Descender. We know that the Gnosis were made from the remains of the 3rd Descender by the 1st and the 2nd. We know that the Archon War was fought to distribute those Gnosis. Ergo, the 3rd Descender must have been put on a shirt before the Archon War, which means, present day, it has been at least 2,000 years since the passing of the 3rd Descender. One thing that's easy to overlook is that the Archon War didn't end in a day and probably didn't start the moment the Gnosis were created. It was a war between gods. In all likelihood, his defeat was much longer ago than that. Weird how it would take so long for the 4th Descender to arrive. almost as if the purpose of the Archon War was to prevent it. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's one more piece of information we know about the Descenders. It's possible for people in Teyvat to become them. We know this because of Nerissinkreuz. That was his plan. He intended to escape the bounds of Teyvat by retreating to the Primordial Sea and returning as a Descender to save the world from the inevitable destruction of the Kranarian cycle. But he made a miscalculation. The Traveler was already the Descender in the current cycle. That's our answer to the question of why only 4. There are 4 cycles: Hyperborean, Natlantean, Remurian, and Kranarian. There are 4 Descenders. That's why there are so many other instances of people arriving in Teyvat not being considered Descenders. Each cycle can have only one entity with that title. But that begs the question, what separates the Descender of the cycle from everyone else that arrives from outside Teyvat? This is where we get into some assumptions, but I think the answer lies in the Nerissan boys' plan to escape the bounds of Teyvat. Credit goes to Blue for this. By the way, awesome creator. I insta-subbed after a single video, and I'm sorry if I watered this down too much. But anyways, I never would have realized this on my own, but there's some special meaning to referring to these as samsaras. Gross oversimplification, the belief in samsaras posits that upon death, you can be reborn or you can ascend. However, if one achieves enlightenment, they may choose to descend into a new samsara. That seems to fit pretty well with Nerissan Dude's plan, right? Shed his mortal coil, escape the bounds of Teyvat, and return to it anew to take his place as Descender. The requirement to become a Descender isn't to originate outside Teyvat, it's to have ascended and made the decision to return. Now some things should start to make some sense. Remember how the Abyss Twins' goal is to recreate our homeworld? That doesn't make sense if Teyvat isn't our homeworld. The Traveler doesn't seem to think so, but remember, the winner of the war between the Descender and the Dragon King gets to reshape the world as they see fit. If the Traveler ascended during a different cycle, the world they came back to would be entirely different. And I'd say it's pretty likely that's the truth of the world the Abyss Twin wants us to find. It's not just tenuous logic that leads to that conclusion either. During the Chasm quest, we find that the flower keepsake from the Twins world is native to Teyvat. That's great and all, but what does it have to do with the Descenders? A lot. Remember, 4 cycles, 4 Descenders. Those cycles are Hyperborean, Natlantean, Remurian, and Kranarian. The Abyss Twin arrives in Khaenri'ah. We also encountered the Abyss Order under his orders investigating in Khaenri'ah. We encounter him again in the Chasm. These civilizations all have some things in common. They existed outside the rest of Teyvat, exhibit similar architecture, and can all be tied directly to one of the 4 cycles. Kranarian is obvious, it's Khaenri'ah. That's our current cycle. The Remurian cycle, oddly enough, is tied to the Chasm. While in Fontaine, we enter the Abyss, and yes, we know that it's the Abyss, there are Abyss portals, and we leave through the same kind of hole the monsters of the Abyss built out of in Sumeru during the Khaenri'ah disaster. This is the Abyss. And what do we see when we turn around? The upside down fountain in the Chasm. Natlantean's direct counterpart in Theosophy is Atlantean, as in Atlantis, the sunken city. And Khaenri'ah is the realm beneath the waves. What else do all these things have in common? Well, they all have a story about an usurper who takes the authority of the dragons, reshapes the world, creates a new human life with that authority, and then fights a war with dragons being led by a dragon king. And in Khaenri'ah, we have the story of the Primordial One. The first throne that usurps authority remakes a world, fights a war with the second throne and destroys it in the process, and wins. Yay! In Remurian, we have another first throne that takes the dragon's authority, remakes the world, fights a war with the dragons led by the Dragon King, and loses. Oh no. Wait, there's also what Apep tells us, that the Heavenly Principles also seized the authority, remade the world, and fought a war with the dragons led by the Dragon King Nibelung. Hold on a second, if the Primordial One in Remus did the same things the Heavenly Principles did, the Heavenly Principles is the first Descender and wins, the Primordial One comes in the second Samsara and wins, Remus comes in the third cycle and loses, oh my. The first and second descenders are the heavenly principles and the primordial one, and they crafted the Gnosis from the remains of Remus, the third descender, after he lost, and the Traveler is the fourth descender. If you're still not convinced the primordial one came after the heavenly principles, look to the beginning of Before Sun and Moon. It begins with when the doves held branches. This is a direct reference to Noah's Ark, the Abrahamic God's second attempt at humanity. He started with Adam and Eve. Why call attention to a story of the world's second iteration in a location tied to what is specifically listed as the world's second iteration if he isn't part of that iteration? But that's not all. It's not just the four descenders. Each has an eminent foe. The heavenly principles has Nibelung. The primordial one has someone. The second throne seems to be kind of a generic moniker for all the eminent foes. I'm assuming we'll find out more in Natlan. Remus has Skyla. The Traveler has the Abyss Twin. That's right, I think the Abyss Twin will take on the role of the Dragon King in this cycle. They arrived with us. If the Descenders are the first usurpers, and the foe is always the second who came, doesn't it stand the reason that they all arrived together? We know that Skyla and Nibelung both came from the Abyss to challenge Remus and the Heavenly Principles, and our twin is with the Abyss Order. If we're the fourth Descender in the fourth cycle, and our twin is using the power of Abyss like Skyla did in the third and Nibelung in the first, doesn't it seem likely that Nibelung also arrived with the Heavenly Principles and Skyla arrived with Remus? But there is something very different this cycle. We haven't claimed the dragon's authority and remade the world, because we can't. I believe that was the purpose of creating the Gnosis and distributing them during the Archon War. In the previous Samsaras, the Descenders just kind of showed up, defeated or stole from the dragons, and claimed authority. After that, they recreate the world, and the Dragon King shows up to try and take it back, destroying everything in the process. But this time, the authorities are bound by the Gnosis and entrusted to the Archons, and this plan seemingly worked. Over 2,000 years without a new Descender. But something changed. Conria summoned us and ushered forth the fourth Samsara. The authorities are being collected again, albeit not by us. Things are moving rapidly as if the world is correcting its trajectory to make up for lost time. Interestingly enough, this isn't the only action that was taken to circumvent the fourth cycle. In the Byakukoku Chronicles, the text Before Sun and Moon originates from, there's a record of experiments being conducted on the evolution of bishops, with a priority of preventing the reincarnation of the Hydro Dragon, at the behest of Tokoyo Okami, who, according to Before Sun and Moon, was a priest of the Primordial One. Even if you don't want to believe he isn't the Heavenly Principles, his interest seemed to be in preventing another global conflict with the dragons. Be he first or second Descender, he still took part in the creation of the Gnosis, which leads credence to the idea that it was in service to that goal. If it seems like I'm intentionally avoiding talking about something, you're right. If the Traveler was originally from Teyvat, passed on, ascended to a higher plane, and returned, why does the Abyss Twin remember Teyvat as their homeland, but the Traveler doesn't? Well, you'll just have to subscribe and hit that bell, because that's its own whole can of worms that I have been itching to talk about for a whole year, and frankly have been begging other creators to look into, but apparently no one has the patience to read Milton. Frankly, I don't blame them. The dude's writing is drenched in the drool of someone fetishizing the idea of becoming a canonized prophet. But still, it's maddening to see all the Gnostic inspirations and Flowers of Paradise Lost and not have anyone be like, hey, I've heard of that book. Maybe they're referencing it for a reason. I don't have a good closing statement. Bye!